Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something super nostalgic, a real blast from the past, early 2000s television. We're going to completely dissect something that you've probably seen literally hundreds of times, but honestly, probably never gave a second thought to. I'm talking about those ubiquitous 15-second funding credits that played right before your favorite cartoons. Specifically, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden machinery behind the hit show Maya and Miguel. So take a second and just think back to the media you consumed as a kid. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, who really funded your childhood? Because, when you sat down in front of the TV, you were just waiting for that awesome theme song to kick in. But the truth is, there was this massive, incredibly complex engine operating entirely behind the scenes, funding those exact moments. Who was actually paying to put those shows on the air? Well, the answer is actually a really surprising mix of corporate branding and federal bureaucracy. Okay, let's dive into this. PBS Kids, where a kid can be a kid. Man, just hearing that iconic piece of branding probably triggers a huge wave of nostalgia for a lot of us. But today, we're not just going to look at this as some fond childhood memory. We're actually going to break it down as a literal masterclass in strategic messaging. To do that, here is our roadmap for the explainer today. First, decoding PBS funding credits. Second, the Chuck E. Cheese branding strategy. Third, the government policy influence. Fourth, building the funding bridge. And finally, aligning play with education. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, decoding PBS funding credits, unpacking the 15-second bumper. So, looking at our transcript sources, there are basically 4 key entities that made the actual broadcast of Maya and Miguel possible. And I just want you to notice the really distinct contrast here. We've got a pizza and arcade chain, Chuck E. Cheese, sitting right alongside the U.S. Department of Education, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and PBS. It is a wildly fascinating mix of corporate interests and highly structured government-funded scaffolding. Moving right along to Section 2, Chuck E. Cheese branding strategy, the business motives. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it reveals the corporate strategy. If we look at the different sponsor credit versions, a really clear pattern starts to emerge. Chuck E. Cheese isn't just trying to sell you pizza here. When they use a tagline like families and fun go hand in hand, they're intentionally building this really warm, family-friendly association. By emphasizing safe fun, they're directly providing parental reassurance. And honestly, my favorite part is how they use phrases like dreaming big things and the joy of learning. The underlying business motive is just brilliant. They're explicitly linking their brand, a playtime arcade, to the rigorous educational goals of public broadcasting. They're basically earning the trust of parents by perfectly aligning their corporate identity with educational enrichment. Which brings us to Section 3, the government policy influence, where bureaucracy meets broadcasting. So, while the corporate sponsors were out there trying to sound as fun and aspirational as possible, the public sector was operating under some seriously rigid policy directives. There were 2 foundational pillars of government funding at play here. The first is a ready-to-learn television cooperative agreement, and the second is a No Child Left Behind grant directly from the U.S. Department of Education. Now, the No Child Left Behind policy was this massive federal education initiative at the time, and we can see exactly how it trickled all the way down into the very funding messages of a children's cartoon. These government grants were strictly designed to support very specific learning missions for kids. All right, Section 4, building the funding bridge, connecting commerce and classrooms. So the absolutely crucial point to understand is how these 2 totally different worlds interact. I like to use a really simple bridge-building analogy to make sense of this. Think of the government grants, the Department of Education and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting as the deep, heavy, concrete pillars of the bridge. They provide the core structural intent and the whole mandate for education. But to actually build the roadway of the bridge, to physically get the show produced and onto your TV screen, that requires additional financial scaffolding. And that is exactly where corporate educational sponsorship steps in. Brands like Chuck E. Cheese provide that top layer of funding in exchange for that family-friendly brand association we talked about. Together, they build the bridge. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between the 2 sides of our bridge. If you look at the corporate branding, it is highly playful and emotional, right? It's all about the joy of learning and creating spaces where a kid can be a kid. Now, contrast that entirely with the public policy language, which is incredibly formal and bureaucratic. It's filled with dense terms like No Child Left Behind grant and cooperative agreement. It's just an incredible juxtaposition. You have this warm, fuzzy marketing directly spliced together with strict, formal government legalese, and it's all happening within a single 15-second TV bumper. Finally, Section 5, aligning play with education, the educational payload. 8. Yes, 8 is exactly the number of legs on the marvelous mollusk featured in one of the show's specific educational segments. Which brings us to the actual payload. I mean, what was all this wildly complex funding actually delivering to kids sitting right there in their living rooms? Well, it delivered dynamic, genuinely engaging science facts. The show actually taught kids that an octopus can do some incredible things. It showed that an octopus can literally watch a person open a jar and then use its own arms to mimic that exact action and open the jar itself. And the show managed to summarize this pretty complex behavioral science by just explaining to kids that an octopus is about as smart as a dog. This completely proves that the bridge we just talked about successfully completed its mission. This funding allowed kids to learn about the natural world through highly engaging, accessible play. So, to wrap this all up, the blend of playful corporate branding and strict government grants successfully created a vehicle for dynamic childhood learning. And the reason this matters, the big takeaway here, is that it shows us the media we consumed wasn't just randomly thrown together. No way. It was a carefully calibrated ecosystem. The corporate sponsors achieved their business motives of earning parental trust, while the Department of Education actually fulfilled its rigorous grant requirements to educate children. Which leaves us with a final, pretty huge question to chew on. How does today's modern media funding landscape, with our endless streaming services, highly targeted ads, and a completely different set of public policies, how does that compare to this really distinct early 2000s era of public television scaffolding? The whole way we fund childhood education has completely changed, but understanding the machinery of the past definitely helps us decode the media of the present. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and honestly, I hope you never look at a 15-second sponsor credit the same way again.